Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. It's time then to see what's making the headlines with the chief political correspondent for The Guardian, Jessica Elgot, and the columnist for the article, Ali Miraj, both of them with us from now until just before midnight. So, front pages then, let's take a look, shall we? Starting with the Metro, which leads with the government's announcements today concerning COVID vaccines and preventative measures to be taken against the virus during the forthcoming winter months, a COVID winter warner, their headline. Telegraph calls the prospect of further difficulties the spectre of winter lockdown. But the Daily Mail takes a more strident tone, declaring, surprise, it's back to panic stations. The Guardian relaying a warning to Boris Johnson from scientific advisers. Plan for the worst. The Mirror highlights the Prime Minister's COVID Plan B. And the Star goes with the government's chief medical officer debunking claims made by the singer, Nicki Minaj, as to the government's, or the COVID vaccine's effect, rather, on the male anatomy. The Financial Times reports that the government has been forced to delay the implementation of checks on EU goods at UK borders to try to keep supplies moving after Brexit. And The Sun going with a smiling Prince William and David Beckham at the paper's Who Cares Wins awards. So we're joined then by Jessica Elgot and Ali Miraj with their thoughts for today. Welcome to both of you. And you've picked the Daily Telegraph to start with. The spectre of winter lockdown returns. We've got Plan A first, though, Ali. Plan B follows. Not much of a mention of lockdown, to be fair, in Plan B.
No, but look, Anna, I think this has been announced today, Plan A, Plan B. Plan A essentially is really focusing on giving booster jabs to the over 50s, prioritising them and prioritising people with immunosuppressed conditions. And also, we also know that the government is now also trying to focus on the rollout of jabs to 12 to 15-year-olds, which last week the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation said it was a very close call as to whether it should be done or not. And it was very marginal. And then the 4 chief medical officers across the UK decided that, on balance, it was worth doing to ensure that kids' education does not get disrupted. So that's another element of it. But Plan B has been kept in reserve, which is if things do get worse, and at the moment the hospitalisation rate is rising, it's much higher than it was at the high peak last year. We also have an infection rate of 30,000 a day. The issue here is that the infection rate, whilst it's high, still not leading to a high death rate, which is good. So that link seems to have been at least broken to a degree, if not completely severed. Plan B is really focusing around the fact that you could potentially have lockdowns. You might have the return of this idea of vaccination passports, which have been kicked into the long grass for now. But the government's keeping its options open. Yeah,
passports, working from home, face masks. I repeat, not a great deal of mention about the possibility of keeping shops or pubs closed or the nighttime economy or schools closing, etc., etc. ABC News Australia, I was intrigued to see, in their reporting of this story, said Britain is preparing for a long, virulent winter without a single lockdown. Can they pull it off? And is that what most people in Britain are wondering too, do you think, Jessica?
I think if you look at what the government's Plan B is and compare it to some of the restrictions that we've gone through, I mean, it's something that is barely, is really barely anything, and plenty of the parts of the toolkit, if you like, as it was described in Plan B, are things that a lot of people are still pretty much doing anyway. It involves, extra mask wearing in shops and on public transport. I mean, that's definitely waned. I don't know about you, but I've certainly noticed less people wearing them. But there's certainly still a lot of people still wearing masks in shops and on public transport. It also talks about reintroduction of working from home advice. Again, a lot of people still have a kind of hybrid working arrangement. A lot of businesses saying they're not necessarily expecting a sort of a full return to the office. Sometimes, in some cases, maybe not ever, and in other cases, it's been delayed until next year. So if this is the toolkit to deal with a massive surge of infections, it still seems somewhat limited. And I suppose what they mean by the spectre of a lockdown is the government's still reserving the right to do it. It still has the power to do it, even though that we know they're repealing some of the measures in the Coronavirus Act. Actually, a lot of the powers come anyway from the Public Health Act in 1984. So the government's still going to be able to close businesses, close schools, if it needs to do so. But I think Boris Johnson is intending to signal that that's not what he wants to do, and they'll have to be dragged kicking and screaming to do it.
Yes, it's a little bit like we suddenly had a tier 4, wasn't it, last winter? The Metro, a COVID winter warner, and certainly the message from Professor Chris Whitty was, amongst other things, Delta is a very bad variant. It's the reason we and the rest of the world have had such a difficult year. We've not faced winter with Delta, highly transmissible. It is a possible combination of winter events plus Delta that ministers may want to trigger all or some of Plan B. And quite frankly, they don't know how we will behave, whether we do still reduce our contacts, which will dictate how we get through this winter, Ali.
That's right. I mean, look, I think what they're doing at the moment is keeping all options open, and they don't want to put out hostages to fortune. So I think they're, as Jessica said, they've got a toolkit out there. And as Boris Johnson himself said, you don't want to play all your shots at once. So they've just got various options here. But look, Chris Whitty's talking about the Delta variant. We know that you can have issues with various variants coming through. And then this plays into a wider issue about, should we really be focusing on giving second jabs or booster jabs, rather, to our own population, rather than vaccinating people in other parts of the world that haven't even had a first jab? And I think there are some people, certainly in the Labour Party, pushing this line that we're not safe until we're all safe kind of argument. And this sort of comes into it. But I do think that Boris Johnson does have to bear in mind the murmurings on his own backbenchers. We've heard from Mark Harper, the head of the COVID recovery group, today, that he believes that testing for school kids should be abandoned because it affects their mental health. We've got Hugh Merriman, the chairman of the Transport Select Committee, requesting that PCR tests should be dropped for people coming back from holidays. So there's a lot of unease on the Tory backbenches right now, and there are a lot of groans in Parliament today when Sajid Javid made some of these announcements on Plan B. So I think the government and the Prime Minister in particular want to proceed with caution and want to try and leave it up to us to be sensible and keep these measures in reserve as a last resort.
Yes, which takes us tonally, at least, to the Daily Mail. Surprise, it's back to panic stations. And Sir Patrick Vallance's message, or the old message that he always had, go fast, go hard with restrictions, won't please people who believe what the Daily Mail says, Jessica.
Yes, he said that his experience of battling the virus says, you have to go earlier than you think you want to. You have to go harder than you think you want to. And he called, he said that the UK was now at a pivot point. And it all feels very different to the way that this was briefed to the Sunday newspapers, and the way that Downing Street perhaps had hoped to present what this winter plan meant, i.e., we've got these kind of toolkits in the reserve, they're relatively moderate measures, and we're going to abolish, some of the measures that we've got in the Coronavirus Act. Actually, what we're hearing from scientists, and I think we'll go on to talk about what SAGE has advised in a few moments' time, is that actually we are at quite a critical moment where we need to start making decisions about, if any, kind of gentle interventions, ones that don't actually really cost the economy an awful lot, things like mask wearing, which is still mandatory in some parts of the country, in Scotland and in Wales. Whether that is actually something to start intervening now rather than waiting for a moment where that may not be enough.
Yes, the sort of SAGE spin-off group that offers advice on modelling has released its data today. That's in The Guardian, Ali. Between 2,000 and 7,000 people a day could be hospitalised with COVID in England next month unless the government urgently implements a basket of measures. I think they actually say that hospital occupancy in England is currently around 6,200. That was the data from when they issued this. Certainly the data given today was that it's over 8,200. But they say 6,200 is only 2.5 doubling times away from the peak seen in January 2021 of 34,000. That's quite a quick route to not great numbers, isn't it, Ali?
I think that's right. And again, SAGE are putting out this warning shot across the bows in terms of, following on from Jessica's point about the government being encouraged to act fast and hard when it needs to. And we learnt this from the pandemic last year. We were slightly later than others to lockdown, which meant we had to stay in lockdown longer than we might have wanted to. and that's a lesson that we need to learn here. But I do think that the Prime Minister is also facing a political reality here, in the sense that you could see that his own backbenchers, I mean, despite what the scientists say, on the one hand, the Prime Minister's got to tread that fine line between what the scientists are saying, whose job it is to prevent deaths. I mean, they've got one single metric, which is to prevent deaths. And the Prime Minister's got to take into account other things in terms of the recovery of the economy, people's mental health, physical health, the impact on the NHS waiting list of people actually going into hospital. So he's got to factor into a whole range of things here. And he's also got to factor in the feelings and the strong emotions of his backbenchers. And this is why there was this reversal on COVID vaccination, which took place over the weekend, because having brought in that national insurance rise last week, with I think Tory backbenchers sort of swallowed, I just think that there was a feeling amongst the government that they couldn't push it too far and that they had to shelve this COVID vaccination thing, at least for now, which is exactly what's happened. So it's a difficult one for the Prime Minister and the government, but I think they've just got it about right so far. As to whether that continues, we'll have to wait and see.
Yes, I know you want to talk about the Daily Star as well. Let's just show you that very quickly. This is singer Nicki Minaj, who was criticised, let's put it that way, by Professor Chris Whitty today. People like that should be ashamed of themselves, he suggested. We'll talk about that one later, shall we? Lots more still to come, including we will take a look at the latest situation with incoming EU goods after Brexit. Stay with us. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Joining me this evening for more, Jessica Elgot and Ali Miraj. Welcome back to both of you. It's not yet 100 days to Christmas, but already there are warnings about getting Christmas gifts in. And meanwhile, or because of, Mr Johnson, the FT tells us, is forced to delay Brexit border checks on EU goods. Now, it's not just Brexit, is it, that's causing the difficulties? It's the pandemic, it's the difficulty of containers. But the Brexit business is an interesting decision today, Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of ended up in quite an odd situation. I think an EU diplomat makes this point on the front of the FT, where it's all about Brexit was all about taking back control, but in fact, what we've had to do is entirely relinquish control on lots of the checks that we might do on importing things that are coming into the country. So, the government's also delaying any paperwork around all sorts of kind of food and animal products, things like eggs, and even like those kind of composite products like lasagna and like a pepperoni pizza or something like that. And the government's basically saying it's got no choice because of the pressures there are on global supply chains. And in the statement from Penny Mordaunt, she starts by blaming the pandemic and says, there's obviously pressures. The EU is under these pressures as well, but that's what's kind of had to force these decisions. But it's not a comfortable position to have to be in.
Yeah, the empty shelves is not a good look, is it, I suppose, Ali? What's your view on this?
Well, I think, to follow on from what Jessica was saying, I think it is a difficult position, and I think it's a confluence of factors resulting in a perfect storm for the government here. It's not just Brexit. I mean, Brexit has created its own issues. Most notably, until recently, with this border in the Irish Sea issue, which has become known as the sausage wars, rather flippantly. But I mean, this is all to do with cold meats being moved to Northern Ireland, and the fact that there were meant to be checks imposed before they went across the Irish Sea. Now, that has caused a lot of problems, not only with unionists in Northern Ireland, but in a broader issue, it's causing political tension in Northern Ireland. And you've then got this other issue now where Lord Frost, sort of under the radar and quite quietly, has decided to push back checks that were meant to be imposed actually this year to next year. So certification of on health grounds of certain imports, etc., will now be kicking in July next year, which is, as he himself says, is a pragmatic issue. But you also add into the fact, Anna, that we've got a shortage of 100,000 lorry drivers at the moment. We've got issues with pay and structural problems with that. And a lot of 30,000 lorry driver tests have had to be postponed because of the pandemic. So you've got this Brexit issue, you've got the lorry driver issue, and you've got general supply chain squeeze. And as Jessica says, the EU sitting pretty because they're imposing their checks on us.
Ali?
And unfortunately, at the moment, we can't impose our checks on them.